Silas Mason had lived in the same modest two-story home on the edge of Mesa, Arizona, for over 12 years. It wasn't a house you'd stop to photograph or even glance at twice. Tan stucco walls, a tiled roof a shade lighter than desert sand, and a lone mesquite tree slouching toward the mailbox were the most visible traits of his property. But it was his, bought without mortgage after selling his late father's antique bookstore in Flagstaff. He was not the type to draw attention, nor the type who invited conflict. He worked from home as a translator, specializing in technical Japanese to English documentation. It was lonely, precise work, and that's how he preferred it. Predictability was his insulation. He didn't attend neighborhood gatherings. He didn't sign up for committees. He paid his bills on time, nodded politely at his neighbors when taking out the trash, and otherwise stayed out of everyone's way. And for over a decade, that balance had been respected, until the noise began. At first it was subtle, a low hum, more vibration than sound, that seemed to resonate through the walls around 3 a.m. each night. Silas initially thought it was a malfunctioning HVAC component, or perhaps something to do with the solar panels he'd had installed 2 years ago. He ran diagnostic checks, reset the breakers, even hired a technician to inspect the electrical system. Everything came back normal. But the vibration didn't stop. It wasn't deafening, just insistent. Like a mosquito trapped behind drywall, always a second away from silence but never quite reaching it. By the 5th night, the sound had acquired a strange rhythm, pulsing in quick, measured intervals. It came from above, somewhere near the corner of the roof directly over his bedroom. Curious but not yet alarmed, Silas climbed onto his roof using the collapsible ladder stored in his garage. It was just past midnight. The desert air was dry and still, and the street below lay in absolute silence. That's when he saw it. Tucked behind the angle of his chimney and partly shielded by an artificial panel designed to look like a vent was a compact metal structure with 4 vertical antenna arms and a small box attached to its base, wired down into the roof. The cables disappeared cleanly into the tiles, which had been disturbed and resealed. Sloppily, but intentionally. The structure was about the size of a large microwave, matte gray, unmarked. No logos, no lights, no labels. But it was humming, faintly but undeniably. He crouched beside it, hesitant to touch anything. The materials were clearly industrial. It wasn't an amateur install. There were no exposed screws, no household adhesives. The conduit leading from the box was industrial grade. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't something a bored kid from the neighborhood had thrown together. Someone had accessed his roof, removed tile, mounted telecommunications-grade hardware, and reassembled it all without his knowledge, without his permission, and apparently without leaving a single document or notice. Descending from the roof, Silas was no longer curious. He was alert, focused. A part of his brain, the part used to interpreting contracts, analyzing phrasing, and spotting discrepancies in highly technical documents, had already activated. He searched his mail, both physical and digital. No notifications, no maintenance requests, no change of service letters from his utilities or internet provider. Nothing. The next morning, he called the city's Building and Infrastructure Office. He was transferred twice before someone could even confirm whether there had been any permit applications for work done at his address in the past 6 months. After 15 minutes on hold, a weary voice came back. There were no permits issued for rooftop access or external installation of any kind. If it's telecom-related, the woman said cautiously, you'd need to talk to the Neighborhood Development Authority. Sometimes those get greenlit through easement clauses in community overlay zones. Silas thanked her, already doubting the explanation. His property wasn't part of a community overlay, at least it wasn't supposed to be. After lunch, he walked down to the only neighbor he had any sort of regular rapport with, Mary Boyd, who lived 2 doors down. Mary was in her 70s, sharp as ever, and known in the block as someone who paid attention. He didn't even need to explain much, just asked if she'd noticed anyone working on his roof recently. Her response froze him. "Oh, you got one too? I thought they were done with those," she said, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Men in gray jumpsuits were on your place. What, 2 weeks ago? Middle of the night. Around 2, maybe 3. I figured they had permission." Silas stared at her, not knowing what to say. Mary continued more quietly now. They were fast. No trucks, no noise. Just climbed up, did something, and left. One of them looked right at my window, like he knew I'd seen. Didn't wave, just stared for a bit, then turned away. That night, Silas slept with his phone's camera aimed at the roofline, recording through the blinds. He didn't catch any movement, but the sound persisted, and his own unease deepened. This wasn't just a bureaucratic oversight or a rogue contractor. This was a violation, not just of property, but of personal sovereignty. No one installs a device that's sophisticated in silence, and no one installs it without a reason. Over the next 2 days, Silas contacted 3 different organizations: his ISP, his electrical utility, and the Office of Municipal Zoning Compliance. None of them claimed ownership or authorization of the device. The responses ranged from politely confused to flatly dismissive. One utility supervisor even laughed softly and said, "Sounds like you got tagged for infrastructure support. It's rare, but happens, especially if your house sits high enough on the block. Elevation matters." When pressed for specifics, the line went cold. Then came the letter. It arrived, folded, hand-delivered, placed under his door without an envelope. Printed on plain white paper in sans serif font, it read, "Notice of Infrastructure Contribution. Per the Regional Communications Act, Urban Corridor Overlay Revision 2022, your property has been selected for enhanced signal relay deployment. This upgrade supports broader network connectivity in the interest of public access and emergency readiness. No further action is required on your part. Access is authorized and exempt from residential consent under Clause 14-EB. Thank you for your contribution." There was no contact number, no official seal, just a line of numbers at the bottom that looked like a case file reference. Or maybe coordinates. Silas read it 3 times, then folded it and placed it beside his laptop. The tone wasn't aggressive. It was worse. It was cold, assumptive, bureaucratically blind. The message had already decided what he was: a node, a structure, a utility asset. For most people, this would have ended in a flurry of angry phone calls, a post on social media, or perhaps the hiring of a roofer to yank the thing off. But Silas wasn't most people. He didn't scream, didn't post, didn't threaten legal action just yet. He did what he'd been trained to do his entire professional life. He documented. He copied the letter, photographed the device, drafted a timeline of events. He opened a file and began to track every anomaly, every delay, every unexplained occurrence, all while remaining completely still on the surface. Because Silas had no intention of letting this happen quietly, what unsettled him wasn't just the presence of the device, it was the method. Whoever had done this had relied on procedural ambiguity, minor zoning tricks, and legal haze to make it feel unstoppable. They hadn't needed force. They'd used silence and paperwork. And somewhere, someone was counting on him doing nothing. That, Silas decided, was going to be their first mistake. Silas had never been a confrontational man, but he wasn't passive either. If anything, he believed in methodical resistance, the kind that didn't announce itself loudly but unfolded with purpose. After receiving the letter slipped under his door, he didn't act impulsively. He studied the wording, then cross-referenced the so-called Urban Corridor Overlay Revision cited in the notice. Hours of poring through public legislative records yielded nothing that could justify telecommunications-grade hardware being installed without owner consent. He found zoning drafts, vague policy proposals about 5G readiness zones, and abstract language about community-integrated infrastructure, but no legal clause that matched the mysterious 14 by. That citation, it seemed, was invented, plausible enough to sound authentic, but not rooted in any document he could verify. His next step was quiet but direct. He drafted a certified letter addressed to the Property Management Board, technically the same committee that handled landscaping fines and mailbox complaints in the neighborhood, but one that had recently grown disturbingly silent. He didn't accuse them of wrongdoing. He simply requested the official permit and the identity of the installer. The response came 2 days later via email from a general inbox. It was terse, impersonal, and evasive. Your concerns have been noted. This upgrade falls under discretionary authority as outlined in the revised coordination agreements between municipal stakeholders and designated infrastructure partners. As your property has been identified as structurally suitable, no further review is necessary. This installation complies with the Telecommunications Access Support Act as interpreted by local administrators. Thank you for your understanding. There was no signature, only an auto-generated header. Infracom Allocation Office. The bureaucracy had shape-shifted. Silas understood the trick. Bury the individual in abstractions. Strip out human contact and hide behind technical language that couldn't be challenged without a team of lawyers. Still, he persisted. He filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the city to obtain a copy of the original site authorization forms. The clerk at the front desk was sympathetic, even apologetic. But she warned him it could take up to 90 days, and some records may be withheld due to national infrastructure exemptions. Days passed. The low-frequency hum in his house continued, subtle but constant, altering his sleep, blurring the clarity of his thoughts. He began to notice strange delays in his devices. His Wi-Fi, usually reliable, would briefly spike in latency every few hours. He caught his computer camera indicator flickering on without input. At one point, his smart thermostat rebooted itself while he was in the shower, blasting cold air through the vents. These weren't dramatic events, just little slivers of disruption, needling him into a state of permanent irritation, a fraying of peace at the edges. On a Tuesday morning, his power bill arrived with a new line item labeled Auxiliary Circuit Usage, Tier 2 Relay Support. It was a modest charge, $38.72, but he hadn't consented to any such usage. He called the power company, only to be transferred 4 times before someone admitted that the charge was applied to properties hosting signal stabilization infrastructure. When Silas explained that he hadn't agreed to host anything, the man on the other end paused, cleared his throat, and said, "Then I suggest you escalate it through the compliance portal. That's all I'm authorized to say." Silas hung up, not with anger but with cold determination. Whoever had orchestrated this wasn't just violating his property. They were monetizing it. Quietly, systemically, and with the help of entities that had no interest in telling him the truth. It was later that day that something shifted. Around dusk, while watering the plants on his back patio, he noticed a black utility vehicle parked on the opposite side of the street. No decals, no license plate on the front bumper, just a tinted windshield and the faint glow of a screen inside. The engine wasn't running. It sat motionless for nearly 20 minutes. Silas pretended not to notice, but when he stepped back inside, he made a note of the make and model. Later that night, the vehicle was gone, but small tire tracks were clearly visible in the gravel along the curb. He didn't call the police. He didn't bother. He knew exactly what they would say. If the vehicle wasn't trespassing, there was no crime. Surveillance wasn't illegal. Nothing was technically wrong. That was the entire design. Make it unprovable. Make it legal. Make it seem like you're the paranoid one for even noticing. That evening, he received a knock at his door. The man was dressed in business casual, slacks, a slate gray button-up, and polished shoes that didn't match the dust of the neighborhood. He was polite, direct, and immediately unsettling. He introduced himself only as Mr. Elwood, offering no card, no firm, no context. His voice was calm but practiced. He said he was part of a community integration feedback group, tasked with assessing satisfaction levels among residents participating in the Infrastructure Partnership Program. "I'm not participating," Silas said evenly, standing in the doorway. Mr. Elwood smiled gently. "Of course, that's precisely why I'm here, to ensure that those whose participation is structural but non-elective still have their voices heard. This process is important to us." Silas didn't invite him in. He asked him bluntly who authorized the device on his roof. Elwood's expression remained serene. "As per Clause 14.b, properties at the highest point within designated microgrids may be selected for elevation-based relay augmentation. Your home qualifies structurally and geographically. Compliance with these programs supports regional latency reduction across emergency bandwidths. It's a public benefit, Mr. Mason." "You're quoting a law that doesn't exist," Silas replied. Elwood tilted his head slightly, as if amused. "The absence of public documentation doesn't preclude legal existence. Many policies function through derivative authorizations. I assure you, everything is in order." Silas didn't answer. He watched the man's eyes scan the interior of the house, calculating, not curious. "May I note that resistance to these programs tends to correlate strongly with misinformation," Elwood added casually. "If you're reading certain forms or contacting unverified legal aid networks, you might find yourself in a feedback loop that's not productive for either side." Silas slowly closed the door in his face. That night, for the first time, Silas couldn't sleep. Not because of the hum, but because of the quiet understanding taking shape in his mind. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a city mistake, or a paperwork glitch, or even just a shady telecom pushing into neighborhoods for faster signal. This was a test. His property, his reaction, his willingness to question, to object, to challenge. It was all being measured. The next morning, a new notice was taped to his side gate. Same font, same tone, same lack of signature. It read, "Due to recent disruption of calibrated relay signal, auxiliary diagnostics may require periodic recalibration. Do not interfere with rooftop components. Enforcement procedures may follow unauthorized adjustments. We appreciate your cooperation." Silas stared at the paper, then at the camera mounted discreetly under the eave, one he hadn't noticed before. It was smaller than a coin, black as the trim it blended into. Someone had been back. Recently. Quietly. And they wanted him to know. He stepped back into the house and locked the door behind him. Not from fear, but from resolve. Whoever was playing this game had made one error. They assumed he had no counterplay. They believed that silence was a guarantee of submission. But Silas Mason didn't play for attention. He played for leverage. And now he intended to take his property back. Not through confrontation, not through protest, but through precision. And he wouldn't be doing it alone. Silas Mason wasn't a man to panic, but he understood the need for escalation when faced with systematic pressure. After the second anonymous notice was pinned to his gate, threatening enforcement procedures for any unauthorized interaction with the rooftop equipment, he recognized the need to shift his approach. Up until that point, he had relied on transparency, filing FOIA requests, communicating through official portals, and assuming, at least in part, that there were institutional answers somewhere buried beneath the layers of bureaucracy. But when institutional logic begins to behave like a closed system, Deflecting, denying, then warning, the rules change. So Silas made a different kind of call. Not to law enforcement, nor to any city agency, but to a mid-level attorney named Marla Yates, a woman he remembered from a neighborhood zoning dispute 3 years earlier, when a cluster of properties had nearly been reclassified to accommodate a new school expansion. Back then, she had been calm, dispassionate, and utterly brutal in the way she dissected municipal language. She hadn't made many friends, but she'd won. When Silas outlined the events, installation without permission, vague legal references, warning notices, financial charges for unauthorized usage, Marla's tone barely shifted. She didn't react with shock or concern, only with a slow, thoughtful hum. "You're not the first to describe something like this," she said, "but most people don't trace it as far as you have. They either give up or cave in. You've got documentation?" He did. Every letter, every photograph, time-stamped emails, screenshots of device activity, even video of the unmarked van. "Good," she said. "Send it all. I'll start with a cease and desist and a demand for disclosure. It won't get them to talk, but it puts them on paper. That changes things." Over the next 2 days, Marla filed a formal demand for identification of the parties responsible for rooftop entry and equipment deployment, citing trespass, property alteration without consent, and unlawful use of residential power. She also submitted a concurrent notice of inquiry to the Arizona Corporation Commission, requesting any records of utility or communications installations linked to Silas's address. For the first time in weeks, Silas felt something resembling traction. Not a solution, but the beginning of a traceable footprint. That feeling didn't last. On the third night after filing at 3:42 a.m., Silas was woken not by the hum, but by a hard mechanical whine and the sound of shattering. It took him a moment to orient himself. The temperature in the house had dropped sharply, and the smart thermostat read offline. In the kitchen, he found a shattered ceramic light cover on the floor and, more significantly, the electrical panel in the garage hanging half open. Wires had been disturbed. A surge had tripped the main breaker and knocked out his interior power circuits. Nothing else in the neighborhood had gone dark. Just him. The following morning, when he contacted the utility company to report the outage, they responded with cool indifference. "We show no service interruption in your area," the representative said. "If the issue is localized to your property, you'll need to file a maintenance request and schedule an inspection." He asked if someone had accessed his meter or panel. The reply was clinical. "There were no scheduled maintenance visits to your address. If you suspect tampering, contact local law enforcement." Silas didn't bother. He already knew how that conversation would go. There were no fingerprints, no video footage. The rooftop camera he'd installed had been disconnected during the surge. Someone had entered his property, disabled his systems, and left with surgical precision. Later that day, an envelope arrived. This one was real, mailed, postmarked, bearing a return address to a firm Silas had never heard of. Inside was a 3-page document, labeled Notice of Technical Oversight Adjustment. The letter stated that, due to irregular behavior and feedback inconsistencies, a scheduled recalibration of the equipment on his home had been initiated during which incidental electrical disruptions may have occurred. No apology was given. No signature. Only a final paragraph stating that additional compliance failure may trigger cost-sharing realignment under provisional load distribution terms. Silas read it twice. It was a warning. "Don't interfere again, or we'll make you pay for what we've already done." He forwarded the document to Marla. Within 2 hours, she called him directly. Her voice was sharper than usual. "They're testing you," she said. "They want to see if you'll break protocol, do something erratic. That lets them reposition this legally, frame it as obstruction, interference with infrastructure. They want to flip the burden onto you." She told him not to engage. Not directly. She would revise the demand letter and begin drafting a tort claim. But they both knew the odds. Whoever was behind this wasn't afraid of claims or notices. They weren't worried about court. They were operating through a shell of permissions and unnamed partnerships, entities that couldn't be subpoenaed because they didn't exist on paper. 2 days later, the escalation became visible. When Silas stepped outside to take his trash bins to the curb, he found a bright orange tag zip-tied to his front fence. It wasn't from the city. The tag bore the words, "Pending Survey. Infrastructure Overlay Evaluation," with a QR code linking to a portal that displayed a satellite view of his home marked with colored zones. Red for signal origin, blue for range echo, and a pale green. Field labeled Ambient Collection Radius. His house, his yard, his garage, even part of the neighbor's backyard, were mapped as operational assets. When he tried to remove the tag, he found it double secured with adhesive epoxy. Later that evening, he walked past Mary Boyd's house, hoping to speak with her again. But her blinds were drawn, lights off. The next day, he saw a different car in her driveway and a woman he didn't recognize. Mid-30s, efficient posture, dark clothes, loading boxes into the trunk. When he asked about Mary, the woman responded that she was relocating temporarily for medical care, then climbed into the vehicle and drove away without saying goodbye. Silas stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the now empty house. Mary hadn't mentioned any health issues. She hadn't even said goodbye. The following morning, he received a second power bill. This one was identical to the previous except for a new charge. Diagnostics load offset. Tier adjustment, $186.94. Silas didn't call the company. He called Marla. "They're escalating through billing structures now," she said. "They're going to keep inflating your operational footprint until it breaks your threshold. This isn't just about bandwidth. They're treating your house like it's a data node, and now they've decided you're interfering with its efficiency." Silas paced his living room. The hum had changed again. It was sharper now, thinner in frequency, and no longer limited to the bedroom. It permeated the house like a second electrical current, a layer of background static that wore at him minute by minute. But worse than the sound was the feeling, the sense that the house was no longer fully his, that every wall, every outlet, every beam overhead was part of something else now, a system, a design, a network that didn't need his permission and had grown comfortable using his silence as consent. That evening, he decided to act, not with sabotage, not with confrontation, but with leverage. He contacted a private telecommunications technician, someone outside the major providers, a former contractor who specialized in interference testing and passive signal mapping. He didn't tell the man what was on the roof. He simply asked him to run diagnostics on the house from the outside, detect signal bleed, frequency bounce, unauthorized access points. The man agreed. He arrived in a nondescript van, wore civilian clothes, carried no branded tools. It took him 3 hours to complete the sweep. When he returned to the front door, his face was pale. "I don't know what this is," the tech said, "but it's not just a relay. That thing's broadcasting multiple frequencies, low band, mid band, and something unlicensed. And it's drawing power through a separate loop I can't even trace. I've never seen anything like it outside a military context." Silas nodded slowly. "Can you block it?" The tech hesitated. "Not without jamming adjacent signals, and that could get you into trouble. But if you can override the draw point, you can at least kill its source. Just be careful. Someone's going to notice." That night, Silas climbed onto his roof for the second time. This time, he wasn't there to inspect. He had brought tools and gloves and a plan. He moved silently in the dark, the city lights bleeding faintly into the desert sky, and he placed his hand on the cold metal casing of the device that had changed his home from a sanctuary into a node. and then he started to unbolt it. The device didn't come off easily, not because of any overt security features or locks, but because of how it had been embedded, like it had always intended to remain there. Silas had expected screws or mounting brackets, but instead found that the underside was affixed with an adhesive compound that had fused to the roof tiles under pressure and heat. It wasn't industrial epoxy. It was something smarter, more pliable and reactive, a material designed to bond selectively to rough stone but release under specific electromagnetic frequencies. At least that's what the technician had speculated earlier, but Silas didn't have access to those frequencies. What he did have was leverage. Literally. He used a slim crowbar to lift under the corners of the base, not to tear it out completely, but to sever the power conduit that had been tunneled into the roof's structure. Sparks hissed, but there was no explosion, no alarm. The hum inside the house stopped immediately. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt natural. He didn't sleep that night. He waited for the knock on the door, the van, the warning notice, the escalation. But morning came, and nothing happened. No visits, no vehicles, no power disruptions. His lights still worked, his thermostat functioned normally, and the strange billing charges on his utility app had disappeared. It was as if a plug had been pulled not just from his house but from the system watching him. It was quiet. Too quiet. And that was the problem. By late afternoon, Marla called. Her voice wasn't tense but focused. "I got a response from the commission," she said. "They say no record exists of any site license at your coordinates. I filed an expedited follow-up. But here's the strange part. An internal flag was triggered when I mentioned your name. Not your address. You. Someone's tracking this at a level we don't usually see for residential claims. This isn't telecom. It's jurisdictional." Silas didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed on the device he had left sitting beside his chimney, a half-dead hunk of metal now, inert but somehow still threatening. "They stopped pulling power," he said quietly. "No charges today. My network's clean. Nothing's pinging the router anymore." "That's not good," Marla replied. "They've gone silent." That silence ended the next morning. A small white envelope was wedged under his windshield wiper when he stepped out for groceries. It wasn't sealed, just folded twice with a single printed sentence on the inside. "Temporary disruption acknowledged. Reinstatement pending. External involvement noted." Silas's stomach tightened. Someone had seen the technician. Someone had tracked the diagnostics. He was being watched, not through his network but from the outside. The wording was clinical, passive-aggressive, but unmistakably clear. He had crossed into territory they did not consider forgivable, and now they weren't warning him. They were planning a correction. He considered leaving, just packing a few things and disappearing for a while, to Flagstaff, or even farther, where no one knew his name or his coordinates. But that thought was fleeting. Running now would be surrendering, and worse. It would mean accepting that his home, his space, could be taken and overwritten without resistance. He had put too much of himself into that house. It was more than walls and furniture. It was the place where he had survived grief, rebuilt his life after family fractures, found quiet again after years of instability. To walk away now would be to erase all of that, and he couldn't do it. So instead, he changed tactics. He reached out to an old acquaintance, Elijah Green, a wireless systems contractor who now worked in back-end operations for a mid-sized telecom rival. They hadn't spoken in years, not since a community radio initiative they had both volunteered for during a wildfire emergency. But Elijah was sharp, discreet, and had access to the kind of data maps that weren't public. When Silas described the events, Elijah didn't ask questions. He just asked for the serial number etched onto the side of the rooftop unit. An hour later, Elijah called back, voice low, almost cautious. That device isn't part of any grid I recognize. It's not registered under any carrier I work with or compete with, but I ran the signal ID through a side-channel analysis tool we use for conflict zone interference. There's a match. Silas didn't interrupt. It's a ghost node, Elijah continued. That's not what we call it officially, but that's what it is. It runs off a hybrid mesh, unlicensed spectrum, usually dropped into rural areas or high-altitude points during emergencies or, more rarely, testing operations. But it's not supposed to be in residential infrastructure. These things are invisible to standard compliance tracking because they're not technically infrastructure. They're probes. Silas closed his eyes. So, someone's using my house as a sensor. Yes, Elijah said, but not just for passive data. These devices can simulate network load, redirect packets, even manipulate latency profiles. If yours was live, it was part of a controlled feedback loop, one that likely mimicked natural data traffic to disguise itself inside urban signal noise. What happens now? Silas asked. Elijah exhaled. Now, you're either going to get an offer to upgrade and normalize it through a friendly partner, or they'll ghost you entirely and switch to pressure tactics. If they think you're hostile, they won't try to negotiate. They'll make the system eat you. Silas didn't ask what that meant. He already understood. That night his driveway was marked. A clean line of red spray paint, perfectly straight, ran from the mailbox to the side gate, stopping at the foundation. No symbols, no words. Just a line. The next morning, the neighborhood garbage service skipped his bins. Packages meant for delivery were marked Inaccessible Address. The city zoning website, when accessed from his IP, displayed an error. This property is pending verification. Please contact your municipal administrator. He sent Elijah a message. Ready to normalize? What does that look like? The reply came within minutes. Lease the airspace. Do it through us. You stay legal. You get paid. The node goes legit, and they lose the shell game. And just like that, a new plan took form. Not protest, not destruction, not retreat, legitimization. If the node already existed, if the structure had already been installed, then its very presence could be weaponized. Not by fighting it, but by converting it. The house was no longer just a house. It was leverage. And Silas intended to use it. Silas knew that what he was about to do would shift the nature of the conflict entirely. Up until now, everything had been subterranean, shadowed, relying on ambiguous authority and presumed consent. But the moment he signed the lease agreement with Threstel Communications, a mid-sized, privately owned network provider known for operating outside the grip of the dominant infrastructure monopolies, the balance changed. The agreement wasn't dramatic. It was a one-page document authorizing the use of Silas's rooftop for a passive relay system, limited in scope, non-invasive in data handling, and fully legal under state zoning and spectrum laws. In exchange, he would receive monthly compensation and liability coverage. It was dry, businesslike, and binding. But beneath the plain language lay a bold act of territorial reclamation. The second he signed and submitted it, he effectively declared sovereignty over his own airspace, territory that, until now, had been treated as someone else's invisible playground. Within 72 hours of submitting the paperwork, Threstel's crew arrived. Not in the dead of night, not through backdoor access, but in daylight, with marked trucks, branded uniforms, permits printed and visibly displayed in plastic sleeves. They moved quickly, surgically. The old equipment, still inert but suspiciously intact, was carefully detached and stored. A new unit, cleaner in design, modular and obviously civilian grade, was installed in its place. The signal routing was rerouted, the power draw recalibrated, and a new service log was added to the municipal grid. Silas watched the entire operation from his office window, coffee in hand, jaw tight. When the team finished, one of the engineers handed him a receipt and a card. "Thank you for helping expand the future." That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept without waking. But victory, as Silas quickly learned, was not a quiet thing. It wasn't a gentle tapering off of conflict. It was a trigger, a flag, a declaration that drew attention from quarters he hadn't expected. The retaliation didn't come in the form of sirens or threats. It came through systems. 2 days after the new installation was completed, Silas received a certified letter from the local housing authority, citing recent modifications inconsistent with community technological standards and requesting a review hearing. The letter was vague, referencing unspecified violations and potential hazard risks associated with unapproved relay equipment. It was clearly coordinated, sent just soon enough to avoid the illusion of coincidence, but not soon enough to have originated naturally. Silas scanned it, sent it to Marla, and waited. Her response was immediate. "They're testing municipal leverage now. If they can't use your roof, they'll try to restrict everything under it." He didn't have to wait long to see the next phase. A city inspector arrived the following week, unannounced but oddly prepared. He carried a handheld scanner, the kind used to measure EUNM fields, and spent nearly 20 minutes walking the perimeter of Silas's house. He didn't enter, didn't explain. When Silas asked what the visit was about, the man simply replied, "Preliminary assessment for signal harmonization. You'll get the findings in the mail." And then he left. Silas knew what would come next. Letters, reports, perhaps a warning. But he hadn't expected the shift to reach his digital life. 2 mornings later, his professional email account, used for all his translation contracts, was temporarily suspended due to a violation of acceptable usage thresholds. The platform claimed that his outgoing messages had exceeded a newly implemented limit for unverified attachments. Silas appealed the decision, only to find that his previous correspondence with clients had been flagged as high-complexity transmission, an absurd label for PDFs and invoices. It was friction, pure and engineered. When he spoke with customer support, they admitted the change had originated from an automated security protocol recently introduced to optimize server efficiency in high-noise zones. Silas didn't need it spelled out. Someone had reclassified his address, or perhaps just his IP, as unstable. This wasn't legal. It wasn't illegal. It was extra-legal discomfort, applied with surgical precision. And it didn't stop there. The garbage service skipped his bins a second time. His streetlight began to flicker erratically each night, but only his. A delivery from the grocery store was rerouted due to geolocation mismatch. When he tried to update his billing address on a retail platform, the site claimed it couldn't verify his residence and flagged his account for review. These were not coincidences. They were calibrated inconveniences, designed not to punish, but to wear him down, inch by inch, hour by hour. Marla confirmed it with cold clarity. "You've been marked as a disruption vector. Not legally. Technologically, your data environment is being throttled through soft-level quarantines." Silas didn't flinch. He adapted. He started using VPNs, rotating his access points, creating mirror accounts for correspondence. He rerouted all deliveries to a nearby Dropbox. He installed a second power monitor to independently track his electrical usage. Most importantly, he pushed forward with the contract, publicizing the lease with Threstel through city channels, filing copies with zoning offices, and forcing a paper trail into existence. Bureaucracies thrive in silence. Documentation was his armor, but the system wasn't done escalating. The following week, Silas received a hand-delivered envelope, this time with an actual return address, the Community Technology Review Council, a committee he'd never heard of. The letter inside wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. He was being asked to attend a closed meeting to discuss alignment concerns regarding independent telecommunications partnerships within regulated civic environments. The language was smoothed, institutional, but laced with implication. Silas knew exactly what it was. They wanted to isolate him, strip the context, make him explain himself in a setting where the rules weren't written to protect individuals. He didn't go. He sent Marla in his place, armed with documentation and a simple message. Silas was within his rights. The equipment was legal. The contract was active. Any further interference would be met with legal response. She reported back later that the committee members were cordial, subdued, and notably unwilling to disclose their affiliations. They weren't interested in compliance, she said. They were interested in deterrence. That evening, Silas noticed that someone had been in his backyard. The motion sensor had been tripped, and small, perfect footprints in the gravel led from the side gate to the utility panel and back. Nothing had been touched, nothing stolen, just a walkthrough, a reminder. But the final escalation wasn't physical. It came through his bank. A routine login attempt was flagged, his account temporarily locked due to suspicious financial traffic associated with flagged telecommunications activity. He spent over an hour on the phone with a fraud specialist who admitted that his account had been swept up in a data-sharing agreement triggered by the leasing contract. "You're fine now," she said. "We just needed to verify the origin of the funds. Some keywords matched active infrastructure investigations." It was an absurdity wrapped in plausible logic. Threstel had paid him legally, and yet, because it involved network hardware, a shadow protocol had reclassified the transaction as anomalous. That night, Silas didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, staring at the quiet device on his roof, now carrying a signal that wasn't theirs, now paid for, now legitimate. And he understood that this was never just about bandwidth. It was about architecture, control by design, not just of systems, but of expectations, of reaction. They had expected him to resist emotionally, to yell, to break things, to call the police and be dismissed. Instead, he had moved methodically, quietly, through contracts and jurisdiction. And that made him dangerous. Because when someone like Silas reclaims his space legally, it becomes precedent. And precedent was something the system could not tolerate. So now they were trying to box him in through the spaces outside the law, through digital pressure, through social mechanisms, through soft infrastructure denial. It wasn't retaliation. It was regulation, punishment by erasure. Not of his rights, but of his comfort. And Silas, staring into the night, realized something deeper than frustration, deeper than indignation. He realized he had won the opening round. Now came the real game. The silence that followed was not peace. It was a reloading of mechanisms behind glass walls, a shift in posture from overt disruption to something more subtle and far more invasive. Silas could sense it in the way his network pings now passed through secondary nodes that hadn't been there before, in the way updates to his operating system suddenly included modules that weren't documented publicly, in how browser queries returned, region-specific results that didn't match his actual location. It wasn't paranoia, it was architecture, the kind built silently around someone who refused to consent to being compliant. The system had retreated, but it hadn't forgotten, and certainly hadn't forgiven. Still, Silas didn't slow down. He doubled down on documentation, printed every receipt, tracked every deviation in service, backed up every log and interaction. He began compiling what could only be called a forensic map of the interference timeline. Not just what had been done to him, but how, when, and through which apparatus. He wasn't preparing to sue. He was preparing to expose, and exposure required precision. He worked not with rage, but with the kind of discipline that only people used to being ignored learn to cultivate. Methodical, cold, exacting. And then, unexpectedly, a gap opened. It came through a man named Corbin, an older contact from Silas's early translation days, now working quietly in legal consulting for civic technology projects. Corbin didn't ask for details. He only said, "Check the zoning vector files for your district, not the public ones. Ask someone from Threstel with city API access to pull the overlay maps." Silas passed the message to Elijah, who by now had taken a personal interest in the situation. Within 24 hours, Elijah returned with a single file. It looked like a GIS map, color overlays, grid zones, lot lines. But one thing stood out. Silas's property was outlined in blue, not white like every other house. And the label next to it didn't say private residential. It said signal asset, contingent, ID 015R. Elijah didn't even try to explain. They mapped you into the system 3 years ago. Quietly. This wasn't recent. Your house was pre-cleared before anything went up. You were infrastructure before you even knew. Silas stared at the screen, not breathing. 3 years ago, he had refinanced the property to fund renovations. There had been inspections, paperwork, signatures. Somewhere along the line, a clause must have been slipped in, embedded like a trap door. Not illegal, just undisclosed. Marla, when shown the file, confirmed his suspicion. They used an anticipatory classification. You never agreed to host equipment, but you gave structural data they could exploit under contingency planning. They used your renovations against you. They never needed you to say yes. They just needed you to stop asking questions long enough to install something they could pretend had always been there. That was the turn. The realization that this wasn't just opportunism. It was planning. Institutional choreography. His house had been predestined to become part of a network he never opted into, and every step he had taken since, resistance, legality, documentation, had been working against a framework already a decade ahead of him. The opponent wasn't rogue. It was systemic. And it had roots. He spent that night digging through municipal archives, permit logs, council meeting minutes, anything that would reveal when the change had occurred. He found it in a line item from a 2021 subcommittee agenda titled Urban Grid Optimization Pilot, Tier 1 Integration Nodes. His address was listed, not by name, not even by number, but by parcel ID. The rage didn't come as a burst. It came as a slow, suffocating certainty. He was never a victim of random selection. He had been drafted, without warning, without context. The culmination of this process, the drone-like silence of technicians, the fake committee letters, the rewired panel, the financial friction, it had all been orchestrated by a system that viewed people as square footage and roofs as bandwidth, extenders. And they didn't fear exposure. They assumed silence, because most people didn't dig. Most people didn't notice until it was too late. But Silas wasn't most people. He took the map, the permit logs, the ID codes, and brought them to Marla. Her reaction was instant. We go public, not with outrage, with irrefutable structure. We'll file a declaratory petition not just for damages, but for status reclassification. And we'll make the zoning commission respond on record. If they flinch, it becomes a precedent. If they don't, we escalate to state-level review. And if they try to dodge jurisdiction again, we bring in press, real, credentialed, legal observers. But Silas hesitated, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Going public was a floodgate. It would bring scrutiny, yes, but also pressure. They might move to revoke the Threstel lease, reclassify his rooftop again, freeze the utilities altogether. He had already seen how far they'd go when unprovoked. Provoked, they might go further. Let them, Marla said. Let them overplay. That's when we cut their hands off. Still, he needed one more piece. Something unarguable. Not suspicion, not implication. Proof that the device had been installed with full knowledge it wasn't consented to. So he went analog. He visited the old records department, not the digital archive, but the physical one downtown, buried in the basement level of the municipal planning office. There, in rows of dusty folders and yellowing maps, he found a set of handwritten inspection notes from 2021. One entry, dated 4 months before his refinancing, referenced an off-book site visit to Lot 49B with a line in red pen. Satisfactory elevation for microgrid prototype. Note: occupant unaware. He took a photo, printed it, made copies. He framed one and hung it above his desk. Then he waited. It took 2 weeks for the city to respond to Marla's filing. Their reply wasn't denial. It was obfuscation. Procedural delays, questions about jurisdictional boundaries, a request for clarity on petitioner's standing as infrastructural subject. It was a stall. But it was a stall that confirmed everything. They weren't denying the structure's presence. They were trying to delay being made responsible for it. That's when Silas acted. He sent a letter, short, plain, final, to the initial anonymous address that had first threatened enforcement. The body of the letter was only one sentence. Your device is no longer operational, your plan no longer quiet, and your assumptions no longer safe. Attached to it was a copy of the inspection note, and a scanned signature from the Threestel lease, and an invitation. If they wished to contest his legal authority to lease his roof, they were welcome to do so, in court, on record, and under subpoena. He received no reply. But that night, the city zoning map was updated. His parcel, once blue, now displayed as private, exempt. The term was rare, used only for properties that had successfully challenged infrastructure designation through prolonged appeal or municipal error. It didn't erase what had been done. It didn't unbuild the architecture that had tried to colonize him. But it marked something permanent, acknowledgement, that they had been caught, that they had lost. That even systems designed to assume silence could be broken by precision, by refusal, and by the will to look directly at what most would rather ignore. And for Silas, it wasn't about victory. It was about territory. His roof was his again. His walls, his wires, his quiet, and from that moment forward, they would not touch it again. Silas hadn't expected the silence to feel different. He thought once the noise stopped, once the power stabilized and the intrusive signals ceased, life would return to what it was before. But this silence wasn't the old silence. It wasn't passive. It wasn't absence. It was presence, dense and full, the silence of something no longer being taken from you. There were no more anonymous notices, no unexplained charges, no surveillance vans. His house no longer felt like contested ground. It felt like territory reclaimed. Not just legally, not just structurally, but spiritually. It was his again, truly his. The designation on the city grid, private, exempt, had changed more than a few lines of zoning code. It had altered the way the system interacted with him. No more bypasses. No more technical oversight. The quiet was not a courtesy. It was a retreat, a surrender, not in words, but in withdrawal. And that, in the end, was the only kind of admission the system was ever going to give him. The device on his roof remained, but not the original one, and not unauthorized. Threestel's unit functioned as intended, legally installed, monitored, and registered. It was part of the city's public registry now, appearing in technical maps under its official license code. A technician came every other week for maintenance, each time clearly scheduled, properly documented, and always concluding with a firm handshake and a respectful, "Thank you, Mr. Mason." These weren't enemies. These were contractors, professionals. They didn't need to hide, and for that very reason, they no longer tried. The difference was night and day, because now Silas had a say. Now there was consent. The neighbors never said anything. Some of them had surely noticed. When the trucks came, when the technician replaced the unit, when the old silent pressure lifted off the block like a storm passing without thunder. Maybe they'd felt something themselves in the months prior. Maybe they hadn't, but they stayed quiet. Not out of indifference, but out of recognition. Something had happened here. Something had been won. And even if they didn't know all the details, they understood enough to stay out of the way. No one asked. No one pried. Silence this time wasn't surveillance. It was respect. Marla, after securing the exemption, moved on. Not from the case, but from the struggle. She had what she needed: the records, the paper trail, the undeniable admission embedded in bureaucratic adjustments. She told Silas she had started advising others now: homeowners, small business owners, even a few church groups, people who had begun to notice strange new poles, odd rooftop boxes, inexplicable utility changes. She didn't lead protests. She filed paperwork. She built cases. Silas had given her a model. Not through outrage, but through procedure. Not through noise, but through persistence. "You can't burn down a system like this," she had told him once. "You make it crack under its own weight." Silas went back to his work. The translation contracts resumed. The software ran without issue. No strange reboots, no camera flickers, no delayed messages. His emails went through. Deliveries arrived on time. The electricity bill was exactly what it used to be. No hidden charges, no unexplained tier adjustments. But more than that, the house felt solid again. It wasn't watching him anymore. It wasn't bleeding data or hosting unseen processes. The walls were walls. The roof was just a roof. He didn't check the cameras every morning. He didn't scan for frequencies before making coffee. Life returned. Not because he forgot, but because he no longer had to look over his shoulder. That, more than anything, was victory. He changed little in his routines. But inside, something had shifted permanently. He didn't trust systems to police themselves anymore. He didn't assume silence meant safety. He understood now that ownership wasn't just a deed or a payment. It was the constant defense of the boundary between you and whatever forces would rather you didn't notice them trespassing. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. And he wasn't bitter. He was sharper. He no longer thought of his roof as architecture. He thought of it as a signal. Not to the networks, but to anyone watching. A marker that said, "This house is not passive. This house does not consent quietly. This house fought back and won. And if they tried again, he would do it again. Not with rage, not with desperation, but with records, with law, with light,